All right, so here we are, lesson 43. We're continuing on in this portion, blandly called by the academics Sub-Roman Britain, much more poetically and interestingly referred to by me and others as the Arthurian age. We've covered background of this time period of the end of Roman rule in Britannia. We obviously covered the fall of the Roman Empire prior to that, at least in passing. And we're going through a number of these major figures from kind of 5th and 6th century British Isles. Right? Last lesson we covered none other than St. Patrick of Ireland, as he's often known, or just simply St. Patrick by virtue of that fame. Today we're moving on to another figure from generations after Patrick, so this is now into the 6th century at this point, and none other than one who is perhaps less well known maybe just today these days in Australia, but one who is deeply known in the United Kingdom, one who's very important particularly and especially in, of course, Wales. In fact, there is probably no Christian of greater renown in the history of Wales than that of St. David, at least in terms of fame and homage, and that is St. David of Wales as we know him. And so a reasonably shorter lesson today, partly by virtue of how much we do and don't know about certain figures. Again, that always usually varies, depending on certain things. Last time when we were looking at St. Patrick of Ireland, we still have extant writings of his, and we went through multiple chapters of the Confessio, the declaration that he wrote. And we know of his other work as well, Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus. We do not have any extant writings from St. David. The reason for that will actually become apparent, apart from the fact that it's pretty normal throughout history anyway. But based on his own nature and character, that'll probably become quite apparent why. But we do know things about him, pardon me, that are primarily drawing from a source coming centuries later, in the technical sense, coming from about the year 1090, so the end of the 11th century, almost 500 years later. However, that Bishop of St. David's, Rugavach, was drawing on archives and historical records that he had from centuries past, okay? So we are able to reach back further into this time period, as well as even just the more general time period of this age in the 6th century from other figures, contemporaries, a man named St. Gildas. We'll cover him, I believe we're actually going to cover him next lesson, if I remember the schedule correctly. But nonetheless, there's some really nice lessons to learn, and obviously a part of our, as we always say, we don't want just wanting trivia, we're wanting to actually have examples to see in their character and their conduct and all the things they did and taught. And the story of St. David is very much a humble one, but one that is quite inspiring given that humility, okay? That's hopefully the aim of our time this morning. So let's dive right in. We're going to do a bit of background here on the man and his background and upbringing, of course. We don't have an exact date, just like we didn't with St. Patrick, but it is pretty closely estimated to be around the year 500 AD, okay, so circa AD 500, in a town which, again, the first $10 prize is for anyone who can pronounce the name of that town accurately, and if you guessed Hunveniu, you would be correct. We otherwise call it just simply Vetus Menevia, which is much nicer and easier to bring into English from the Latin, okay? The term Menevia is going to become more important, right? And it's part of a region called Ceredigion, which is in western Wales. At the time, of course, it wasn't called Wales, but it's what today is the modern nation of Wales there in the United Kingdom in the island of Great Britain. We know who his parents were. His father's name was Sant or Santus, ultimately, ironically, from the Latin term meaning sanctus or holy, and from his mother, who was actually beatified, Saint Non, okay? And there is some disparities in some of the records, but the records seem to indicate, at least in the majority sense, that David was actually the product of the sexual assault or the rape of Non by Sant. The significance of this is the fact that Sant himself was actually a prince of the kingdom of Ceredigion, okay, ergo why David is then born there. Sant's father was the founding king of that kingdom. A lot of these kingdoms in this middle time period of Britain, because Rome has now evacuated, there's now the rise of new kings and warlords and chieftains. A lot of those terms are usually synonymous. There are different tribes vying for control of different portions. We looked at that last week, especially mentioning about the fact that there's the Picts and the Gaels, or the Scots as we know them, the Anglo-Saxons coming over, the native Britons, the Romano-British, they're trying to fight and survive and do these other things. Even by this point of the year 500, the Britons, who become the Welsh, have largely been, or overwhelmingly been, pushed back, not entirely but mostly, into the western portion of the island of Great Britain, which is why Wales becomes the territory of Wales as we have known it for the last 1,500 years. Okay, it's effectively the line that the native Celtic Britons were able to hold against the Anglo-Saxon incursions. Right. He himself, as I said, the founding king was Ceredig, so Ceredigion, right? Meaning that in the case of David, he is actually technically descended from the founding royal dynasty of Wales, which was called the House of Gwynedd. Okay. There's a map that you have on what is page 2 of your notes, ultimately, just to give you a bit of a picture of where on earth we're actually even talking about here. This is, again, circa 500, right in this kind of post-Roman period of what we now call Wales. Right? If you look on the western coast, okay, there you'll see about halfway up, Ceredigion, okay, Ceredigion, Ceredigion. That's the region that he was born in. That's the petty kingdom that he was ultimately born into. And many of these kingdoms, even if you kind of glance your way around at names you may or may not be able to pronounce, and that's totally fine. Gwynedd was the overall kingdom in the north, Chros, Powys, various different other ones, David, Brechenniog in the south, etc., Gwent. All these are kingdoms which the sons of this founding king in Wales, a man named Cynedda, had established, and his sons inherited the various territories, and these regions were then named after them, right, coming from this one family. Okay, David himself, the product of a very sad and tragic scenario. Okay, what appears to be the forcible taking of this woman Non by one of the princes of Ceredigion. Right? But even and alas, the point that can actually be made here, and there is something that is an interesting point, is the fact that, as we kind of will go on to see, he ended up fortunately being blessed with a very good education by another very pious and prominent Christian of that time, a man who we know as St. Paul Aurelian of Lyon. Lyon is referring over to France. He is himself, we're not covering this specifically, pardon me, but during this time of the incursions and invasions and the waves of migration and so on from the Picts and the Gaels and particularly the Anglo-Saxons, there are Celtic Britons which fight back, Arthur coming from that stock, and eventually hold the line and settle in what is today Wales. There are others who are forced to essentially evacuate Britannia as a whole. They cross the English Channel and settle in the land in the far western peninsula of what is France called Brittany, if you've ever heard of that. Okay. It's called Brittany because it was Britons that fled there and settled there. Right? There were 7 founding clergymen who led those people, those Celtic Britons, out of Britain in this kind of proverbial exodus across the seas almost, and settled there in western France as Celtic peoples. Okay, St. Paul Aurelian was one of those men. Right? And David, was educated by him quite extensively. So he had a very robust education, also himself coming from this aristocratic or royal background, I suppose you would say, provided this very interesting dynamic of a young man who who knows, of course, he is the product of tragedy and of wickedness. He is an illegitimate son in that particular sense. He obviously was never destined to then become a prince or a ruler of Ceredigion or elsewhere, but was fortunately cared for and loved by his mother, was instructed and educated, had access to resources and other things that he otherwise would never have had access to, right, like education and things like this. It is eerily similar in a sense, not literally the one for one, but a number of similarities to the story of Moses in many respects. One who is raised in tragic circumstance, in this case he having been abandoned, necessarily, based on the story, right? They were seeking to slaughter the innocents there. But then rescued and actually having God's providence guide the hand and destiny of the young Moses into the royal house of Egypt, right? Into the royal court, the very same royal court, the same royal house which attempted to slaughter all the firstborn sons of the Israelites. It's a somewhat similar scenario to that. And St. David is one of the key figures that I've ever used when talking about even though, again, amidst the genuine wickedness and tragedy that comes about as a result of that in the case of rape, that the modern ethos that is often used as an argument, even though it happens very, very, very rarely in actual statistical senses, but the common argument and one of the key chief justifications that are ever given for the promotion or the accessibility, of abortion is, well, how about the mother or the woman who is raped? Right? Should she have to keep that child, carry that child to term? And the fundamental question, apart from these details, is the basic moral and ethical imperative of why is it that the child, that young boy or that young girl, deserves to face death for the sins of his or her father? The answer is they don't. We don't punish children for crimes that their parents commit. We punish the person who committed the crime, right? If anyone should be facing death, it's the rapist. That's who should be facing death, not the child, right? And especially when you look at the way that we treat sexual assault cases in Australia with just absolute weakness and spinelessness. And there are people, men and women, in prison for serious sexual assault charges, including rape, that are in there for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years. It's insane. The idea of snuffing out the fate and the life and the destiny of someone who has had no control over the circumstance of their own generation, their own birth, is an abhorrent idea. And St. David ends up becoming this beautiful image, quite frankly, of what man intended for evil, God intended for good. Right? The product of an egregious sin and crime ended up in that circumstance providing this young child with things that otherwise he would never have had, like education and accessibility and upbringing. All that comes with that, from theology to writing to language, rhetoric, and so on and so forth, that ends up proving, quite frankly, as I mentioned, they're invaluable in his later life and ministry. Right? It's why we must always be sure to not play God and to uphold our principles no matter what, because the children of instances of rape or sexual assault do not deserve to have their lives taken from them because of the fact that through no fault of their own at all, nor their mothers, they were conceived in that fashion. Right? But speaking of his life and ministry, let's start to look a bit about that. Right? The reason why I made a point there is because the nature of his birth, or the circumstances, say in this case technically, the circumstance of his birth, is something which certainly seems clearly to inform deeply his own view of himself and other such things. Right? Even in ways that might seem surprising, right? There are some records I mentioned there that indicate, we're not 100% sure of this, but there is some evidence that he may have at some point made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and received a blessing, or what we call an anointing technically, from the Patriarch or the Archbishop of Jerusalem, right? That might be part of the hagiography, so that may be a detail that is being played up in some of the writings, but there is some reason for thinking that it may have happened, because there are some contextual details that indicate it could have. But what that does is it sets the stage for a man that would come from this humble estate in the sense of product of rape, and also throughout most of his time in his life, a clergyman, or in this case actually an abbot, the leader of a very small and minor and pretty insignificant monastery. Okay? But this backing of things in his life and in his early years are going to set the stage for his later prominence, which occurs really again much by the acclaim of his contemporaries. His life as a minister and as an abbot, his life in essence as a clergyman, is one that's very clearly steeped in a renown for teaching and preaching. He was obviously very eloquent. That's going to become more apparent by the time we get to the end of today's lesson. He clearly, by virtue of education, had skill in language, had skill in rhetoric, these kinds of things, and used those skills for good. He used those skills for preaching the gospel. He used those skills for instructing wisdom and knowledge to the ignorant and unwise, right? He became quite well known, at least in his little pocket and corner of, of Britain and the world, for this, by using the various privileges and blessings that he'd been given by virtue of, in technical sense, being born into the access of one of the royal families there in Wales, to use that for not self-promotion, but for the embetterment of other people around him. Right? He, by virtue of that access, and including also, again, access to resources, was then quite famous for having founded many churches and monasteries in and around southern Wales. Okay? He establishes churches particularly all across Wales. He establishes them as well across the Bristol Channel in what was called at the time the Kingdom of Dumnonia, which is basically Cornwall, so the West Country, if you're familiar with England at all. What is today basically Cornwall and Devon, the peninsula there, as well as even over in Brittany that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so he had a heart for ministering all three of these places: Wales, Dumnonia, or Cornwallum, as it was called in Old English, and Brittany were all Celtic lands. Okay, it's part of what we call the Celtic column that runs basically north to south through these lands up to Scotland and Ireland. Right. So his ministry to his people, the Celtic Britons, was something that he had a really deep heart for. He had a yearning for seeing the gospel maintained and Christianity flourish amidst his people, the Celtic Britons, during a time of, like we've been seeing so far, massive world-altering, from their own perspective, world-altering upheaval and change and war and destruction and calamity and all of these things which are happening in this extremely volatile time in sub-Roman Britain, right, or the Arthurian age, okay? And so he himself ends up holding for most of his life, this long tenure, and I refer to it as a humble tenure, as the abbot of Menevia. Okay, so Menevia is the part in the region, ultimately more broadly where he is born. But if you look on, it won't be on screen, but if you look on your little map there, page 2, his monastery, if you look down, you see in the bottom left corner the region which is pronounced Dyfed, D-Y-F-E-D, in the bottom left corner, and you see that there's a far western peninsula, right? The furthest western point you can find there. That is where he establishes a monastery, okay? In that broader region called Menevia. We today know it as St. David's, okay? These days, going back to about 1,000 years now, there's a massive, beautiful cathedral there. It's called, of course, St. David's Cathedral. The broader region of this part of Wales these days known as Pembrokeshire, okay? But this site is the original place where he founds this monastery and church community back in the mid-6th century, right? So Christianity has had a centre there, a home there for 1,500 years, right? That very same site. That building is obviously, like many of the great cathedrals and castles, a part of the Norman period of English history, so High Middle Ages and onward. But the site, which has been destroyed and rebuilt, eventually the monastery was actually destroyed by the Vikings, by Viking raiders and Irish coming over from Ireland, parts of which they'd conquered by that point. And so these days there's that cathedral, right? But this is the place where he lived, a place where he ministered. And the reason why I refer to it as a humble tenure as the abbot, an abbot being a leader of an abbey, right? In other words, a monastery, right? You've heard of like Westminster Abbey, for example, okay? This was the Abbey of Menevia, right? Or what we later call St. David's Abbey, eventually St. David's Cathedral, is that he was also equally steeped in the monastic tradition. And Christianity has had a long history of monasticism, going back to about the 4th century AD, right? Positive elements, later on negative elements that did need to get cleaned up in the Reformation, right? But on the whole, the monasteries during this time served as an absolutely crucial institution, for lack of a better term, right? In fact, to such a degree that the significance culturally and historically of the monasteries during this time of the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain was literally instrumental to their survival. right? Not only in Britain, by the way, but really everywhere across Europe, Western and Northern Europe, including in places like Gaul, which we've talked about before with King St. Clovis I, right? Various other places as the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Burgundians and so on and so forth, are all conquering around the world. The monasteries were these, I say this in a colloquial sense, fortresses almost. They were these fortified places where Christian community could survive. And it is not actually hyperbolic at all. In fact, there's multiple historians, ecclesiastical historians and otherwise, who have written in these very terms, right? In that, the monasteries in Europe, Western and Northern, including obviously Northern Europe, Britannia, are almost single-handedly responsible for saving and preserving written language in Europe. Okay? Almost single-handedly. In some places, literally single-handedly. In some places, they were the only thing that preserved it, because the monks there, the Christians there in those monasteries, and nunneries as well, right, are copying the scriptures and preserving church writings and so on and so forth. They're learning languages, they're maintaining Latin, they're maintaining the native languages, they're translating the scriptures from Greek into insert language like Gothic or what would be called Old Welsh at this point, or Old English eventually, so on. You get these pictures. They're preserving even the scriptures, right? So the debt that of gratitude almost that comes these days from the monasteries is usually very undersold, right? Monasteries, God used the monasteries to play an absolutely critical and vital role in the preservation of and survival of Christianity in Western and Northern Europe during this time, with the pagans and the Arian heretics rampaging their way across much of the continent, right? And so what that produces, obviously, is that when you're in that kind of environment, there is a very, pardon the pun, insulating effect, right? The Celtic Britain language is technically part of that language family is technically called Insular Celtic, right? But there's this insulating effect, because it's almost like, that's why I refer to it colloquially as a fortress almost, because it's a bulwark against these things, against the decay and destruction of things on the outside, right? Because there are no schools and academies when the entire village has been burnt to the ground and ransacked, right? Even more pragmatically speaking, the opportunity and availability of time even to study, to scribe, to be tutored, just isn't there when you're focused on just surviving the next week, right? How are we going to survive the winter because the Saxons have just rampaged their way through and burnt and or taken our crops? Do you know what I mean? You don't have time to be doing these various other things. It's why all the great things of high culture, particularly and especially in Europe, of the arts, right? Of classical music, of course, by that later point, of sculpture, of painting, of all these various things. They're only poetry, pick anything up. They're all only possible when you are in an environment that is stable and ordered and safe, for lack of a better term. Do you know what I mean? This is the opposite of that time. This is the antithesis of that. This is a time of chaos and collapse and destruction and constant flux, right? The monasteries become like the ark in the ancient flood. They really do, right? Wherein language, even writing itself, is preserved. And in that, because of this circumstance, this is where it's in that culture of the monastic life and in the monasteries where the culture of significant humility and self-deprivation is inculcated, right? So David spent most of his life living off of water and bread that was mixed in with spices and herbs, right? Going obviously above and beyond what other Christians were doing, but nevertheless, without being explained, in some cases not too much, because like I said, when crops are getting destroyed or when herds are being killed off as an act of war against you, right, blah, 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 Part of it is actually also out of just availability, right? But there is a deep sense of asceticism, as we say, right? So self-denial that is being born in this time, that it's born out of this time period of the collapse of the Roman world, right? That had its benefits, had its advantages. At other times in history, it hasn't. So by the time we get 1,000 years later to the point of the Reformation, it's become actually detrimental and problematic, not universally, but in many respects, right? So there needed to be reform, or what's called the disestablishment of the monasteries in the days of Henry VIII, the Tudor king, right? But in these days, monasteries were vital and necessary, even just for the physical protection, because of the fact that in many cases, like I wouldn't even know where to begin trying to calculate how many women have quite literally had their lives saved. And I don't mean that like literally, by virtue of entering a nunnery. Their husband dies. It could be their village gets slaughtered, the majority or maybe even all of the men, if they've gone out to fight and they lose and they're now dead, and now it's a woman with 9 children in 5th century Britain. Good luck, right? You have no options. Even if it could even just be things that are even less kind of obvious. It can just be the mere tragedy of the fact that your husband or your father or whatever the context is where you are in life dies just by tragedy. He falls off a horse. He slips and falls off a cliff. He's cutting down trees to build things and the tree falls on him. Like there's all kinds of things that can happen. And without that protection and provision, it could almost be a death sentence. Not always, but I'm saying in certain circumstances it could just be destitution, right? And the things that would have to come from that in order to try and survive. Nunneries, being able to take women into those communities with other women, where they're now all supporting each other. They've got land, because the monasteries have land, and that they are able to maintain and control. They have crops, they have vineyards, they're basically almost like homesteading effectively, right? Community for prayer, all these things. So on the male side and female side, the monasteries, in many respects, were life-saving, right? And so even as a Protestant, the monasticism has played an extremely important role, and it informs David deeply because he's leading this. So David's own outlook on this is clearly, and again, not that he ever wrote, we don't have any writings from him, and this is never written about him, but it's a very reasonable and rational inference to draw, in that by virtue of the circumstance of his birth, I think it can be rightly articulated that there is this kind of natural humility that comes to him, almost, as I say, naturally, that he's very clearly deeply humble by nature, even though technically he's actually descended from the royal house of Ceredigion and ultimately the royal house of Gwynedd, right? That doesn't really seem to play on his own character and sense of self or identity. It's as if that tragic and dark circumstance of his birth ingrains this inherent humility in knowing that he's been born of that circumstance, right? And so he never tried, and more importantly, born of that circumstance into a royal line, and that he has earned nothing. And so everything he does and everything he says and everything he teaches is just dripping with this sense of not necessarily self-deprecation, but as I say, humility is the appropriate word for it. Right? He's clearly a very humble man who realizes that everything he has in life is clearly by the providence of God. Right? Despite the great tragedy of his birth, God used that evil for his good and ultimately the good of all Wales. Okay? In that he could then learn, and now he's educated, and now he's one of very few people in all of Britain, comparatively speaking as a ratio, who are educated, who can read and write, who's trained in rhetoric so he can communicate properly. Do you know what I mean? All of these things, which wouldn't have come about except for the circumstance of his birth. Right? He's clearly highly trusting in the sovereignty and providence of God in and over his life. And this becomes very apparent in the kind of climactic event in his life which is actually a church council, okay, a synod technically in this case, what we call the Synod of Brevi, right, B-R-E-F-I, the F pronounced like a V, Brevi. This was one of a number of church councils of synods that were convened in Britain during this time of the 6th century. In this case of the Council or the Synod of Brevi, convened starting around the year 545 in specifically Brevi, which is in Ceredigion, so it's actually from the part southwestern Wales where he's from. Okay, convened for a very important reason, right? But the sources that we have from that time period, there's a couple of different sources that we have. Either later on ones from Ruggevark, which is drawing from archives at St. David's, because he was the Bishop of St. David's at the time in the 11th century, or even some other earlier sources that are basically contemporary to this indicate this is actually a huge church council by comparative standards at least, right? All 118 bishops across the island of Great Britain are said to have been there, along with elders, so other clergymen, presbyters in other words, right, where we get the word elder from, right, pastors, abbots of the different monasteries, of course, like he is, kings and princes as well, including obviously massive amounts of the laity, right, of the churchgoers themselves. Okay, it's described as an ecumenical council of the whole of Britain by Ruggevark, this later source drawing on earlier sources, right? So a huge council, and the particular issue was specifically to deal with what's called Pelagianism. Okay. So he himself, it itself, apart from dealing with other ecclesiastical matters like certain ordinations of another figure named Saint Daniel, which is the Welsh name for Daniel, and other things which usually these councils do, administrative things in other words, like they always usually do, the primary purpose was to combat a resurgence in the Pelagian heresy. Now, we haven't focused on Pelagianism, just simply by virtue of the fact that it would take up too much time. But Pelagianism is a heresy, like all ones, are usually named, almost always named after the heresiarch, the arch-heretic. In this case, a man named Pelagius, right? Pelagius, but Pelagius as we say in English. Pelagius was actually from Britain, okay? Pelagius comes about in the late 4th, early 5th centuries, okay, so about 150 years before this time. He is a contemporary of St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, various other ones like this, St. Ambrose, etc., St. Jerome. And he begins teaching, this is during the twilight of Roman Britain, which of course ends in 410 AD. And Pelagius fundamentally denied original sin. Okay, he believed and taught a doctrine that the Romans had, which was called tabula rasa, which is simply Latin for a blank slate. So tabula, where we get the word tablet, not the one that you put in your mouth, but a tablet, like the tablets of stone that Moses had, okay, or the electronic tablets we have these days, like an iPad, right? Tabula rasa, blank tablet or blank slate, okay? This was a teaching in Roman philosophy, okay? That, long story short, teaches that human beings are inherently neutral by nature and that it is only subsequent events in their life which then impact them for good or for evil, okay? The problem, of course, of that is the fact that that is very obviously heretical in the Christian religion. Okay, we are clearly told that our actions and the things that we do in life are born of our nature, our character. Okay, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. No one is good, no, not one. We're actually about to literally cover that in tomorrow's Bible study, right? In Romans chapter 3. Okay, we have all been impacted by the curse of the fall in our ancestors Adam and Eve. Okay, that has had an effect upon the human condition. Okay, it is the metaphysical and ontological reason why there is evil in the world subsequently throughout the countless generations of man, right? By denying that, what he then fundamentally taught as a result of that teaching, the denial of original sin, is that our justification before God is a personal choice. It's what's called synergistic in the technical sense, where we get the word synergy from, okay? It is, we are free and able to choose to come and be right with God. Whereas again, the Christian teaching is that no, we are dead in our trespasses and in our sins, and we need to be made alive in Christ. We need to be born again. And that this is done without human hands, i.e. spiritually by God. Okay? It is God who calls us. It's God who convicts us in our conscience. It's God who then cleanses us of our sins in baptism. It's then God who grants us his righteousness. All these things. Justification, how we are made right with God, is what is in technical terminology called monergistic, meaning monos, meaning one. Right? It's one way. Okay? This has always been the basic Christian position in terms of justification, that moment when we're made right with God. Okay? Pelagius denied all that. Okay? It had been mostly dealt with during the days of St. Augustine. In fact, St. Augustine and Pelagius were big rivals. Pelagius was basically Augustine's biggest rival in the church. Okay? And St. Augustine wrote considerable works against Pelagianism. Okay? It had waned, but was now 150 years later having a resurgence, almost like a revival, in Britain. And so they needed to convene a council to deal with that problem, okay, to be able to try and fix it. Just like church councils have been convened, we've studied obviously in the early church portion, like we're dealing with the Arian heresy in the fourth century specifically, right? Himself, referring to David, although, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a very minor abbot in his own monastery there in Menevia, right, in a very small, effectively, settlemental village, which was almost entirely built around the actual abbey itself, he clearly was hesitant to attend, essentially by virtue of not really thinking himself to be of much use or worth. He actually says at one point in some of the archival records that are then later referenced that really the best he could do would be to pray for them. Right? He didn't think he could be of any more use to them other than praying for them, because of course as a leader of a monastery he spends all day long praying, right? As is of course the culture of the monasteries. But nevertheless, when things are getting dicey at that council and when there are serious speeches in defence of Christian truth that need to be made, a number of his own contemporaries, his peers, call on him, send for him to come, right? There were some very senior clergymen and ministers present there among the bishops of Britain, right? And even a number of them, knowing that he was a very good speaker, very good rhetorician and well educated, wanted him to come and make a defence, right? And so eventually he placates them and comes, and he makes a absolutely rousing speech in defence of Christian truth and of the gospel, because the reason why Pelagius was a heretic and what he's teaching was a heresy is because to deny original sin, to deny the curse, is fundamentally to completely undermine and change the gospel, right? Completely, okay? Because in technical terms, in Pelagianism, because in theory you are a blank slate, if your life and circumstance and everything else is bent toward good, Pelagius very clearly taught that you can actually be righteous of your own standing, which is flat out heresy, right? Very obviously. So by doing that, there's literally no need for salvation. What are you being saved from? Right? Do you know what I mean? So it's a denial of the entire person and work of Jesus Christ ultimately, right? It's a very, very dangerous heresy. It has even in our day come back, not in the same way or to the same degree, or actually some cases in the same degree. Pelagianism came back with a vengeance in the Enlightenment very heavily. In fact, many of the Enlightenment philosophers quite literally taught tabula rasa, right? So John Locke, famously the English philosopher of the 17th century, right? Who is the founding father of liberalism as a political philosophy, okay? He himself was a Pelagian, okay? He denied original sin, he denied any of those elements. He believed very firmly in tabula rasa, as did many of his other Enlightenment contemporaries, right? So by virtue of that also explains so many things down the pipeline. It's why today the concept to any modern Australian or American or Canadian or Englishman or Kiwi or really anyone in Europe, the idea that they are inherently enslaved to sin, or that they are corrupted by nature, or that they're even just a quote-unquote, to use modern terms, bad person, in the sense of like morally speaking before God, is not just foreign to them, it's offensive. Everyone thinks they're a good person, right? Everyone inherently thinks that they're totally fine with God. That's why even just the person who doesn't care anything for God or anything for Christianity or for church will even maybe potentially, as I've had countless times, concede that, oh, well, if that happens, I'm sure I'll be fine. You won't be fine. You definitely won't be fine, okay? None of us will be fine, just flying by the seat of our pants. But what that is Pelagianism. Like, it literally is Pelagianism, because Pelagianism comes back in the Enlightenment very clearly, in the literal form of figures like John Locke and others, okay, who are also writing about, I don't want to rehash sermons, but when they're also constructing their political philosophy is entirely premised on Pelagianism, right? The very concept of everyone voting is premised on people being a virtuous and good citizenry. Except by nature we're not good and virtuous. We can be, by the grace of God, but not inherently, right? So the revival even of democracy and republicanism is born of this idea because, of course, the cultures which gave birth to democracy and republics, Greece and Rome, believed in tabula rasa. That's why it's a Latin phrase. The Roman Republic was built on the idea of tabula rasa, right? Either way, that's always been a heresy in Christianity, and it comes back in this setting here in the case of Britain, and calling for the Council of for the Synod of Brevity to defend that, right? So he gives, as I said, this rousing speech, this courageous speech, which was loud and heartfelt, and said it with his chest and roused the crowd, as I say, right? And the Council of Brevity, Synod of Brevity, the Synod of Brevity ends up rightly condemning and anathematizing Pelagianism. He gives a formal declaration. Like most of these things, you give the declaration and there's still then the ongoing lingering battle, right? But you've now got the basis on which to actually start cleaning these issues up in the churches, right? There's then a follow-on council about 20 years later, roughly speaking, 25 years later, called the Synod of Caerleon. Caerleon is in southern Wales. Became colloquially known as the Synod of Victory, because that's when they fully managed to basically to extinguish Pelagianism in Britain, right? It's much like what happened with, if you recall it, or if you were with us in the early church portion of the course, the first and second ecumenical councils, right? So the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the Council of Constantinople in 381, right? They're both dealing with the Arian heresy, right? The way these councils often go is you have the initial council to work out the problem and to formulate an official statement that can then be used based on the scriptures to then start fighting back against the spread of this heresy. And then as that battle is going forth, you then usually end up needing to have another council to kind of, as the decisive nail in the coffin, if that makes sense, right? It's the same thing that happens here, right? So that's why it was called, in popular terms, the Synod of Victory, right? Because it was where they were victorious. The church was victorious over Pelagianism once and for all. And Pelagianism never comes back in Britain until the Enlightenment. Okay, but alas, he ends up leading that actual synod himself. Specifically, he ends up leading that because what had happened for him is that he actually ends up getting proclaimed. What happens? So first and foremost, what at the time was Menevia gets renamed St. David's. Was then that tiny monastery out there on the far western peninsula of Wales ends up getting honoured with metropolitan status. In other words, metropolitan is how we think of it. A metropolitan, or a metropolis, was the Roman concept of a city. Right? That's why we have the term metropolitan these days, right? A metropolis, polis being city. In the church context, metropolitans were just that. It was like Rome or Constantinople or Jerusalem, right? Like big significant cities, right? This is a tiny little place that even to this day has maintained metropolitan status. So technically it's the city of St. David's, which has the gargantuan population of 1,472 people. 1,451 people, right? It's the smallest city in all of Wales and England. It's actually the smallest city in the entire United Kingdom with 1,500 people, not even, because it's maintaining this ancient honour that was given 1,500 years ago. And so he actually ends up getting proclaimed the Bishop of Menevia, which ends up functioning as Archbishop of all Wales. So because of this act of courage in defending Christianity against the enemies of it there at the Synod of Brevity, he, like a great leader that he was, humble, unwilling to kind of step forth and wanting to just remain in his humble corner estate there on the far outskirts of Wales, ends up rising to the occasion and ends up being rightly honoured as the most influential and powerful clergyman in all of Wales, and really much of all Britain at that point. And that's a legacy that actually lasted for centuries after him, right? When we eventually get onto the multi-part series on the life of King Alfred the Great, the founding King of England, we will be looking heavily at Alfred's own love and care and interest and devotion to education, among many other things, obviously. For Alfred, one of his primary sources for scholarship and teaching and education that he relied on was St. David's. So St. David's maintained for almost 1,000 years, basically, after this time of St. David himself, a deep culture of learning and education, right? Well beyond the time of this, right? So he establishes a legacy there that lasts basically 1,000 years, right? To the point where, as I said, the founding King of England deeply relied upon monks, right, scribes and scholars from St. David's to come over to Winchester in Wessex and to teach and to educate and to build educational programs all throughout England and so on and so forth, even though there was, obviously centuries later, still a very tenuous relationship of sorts between the Welsh, Wales, and the Saxons, right? Alfred bridges that gap through the monasteries and through the educational programs they have and the deep culture of learning and such things, going back for him 300 plus years, basically 300 years, to St. David, right? So the legacy of this one single guy, deeply humbled by nature, although a powerful speaker, probably pretty introverted and reserved, it appears to be, at least in terms of his own personality, could rise to the occasion. And one who was a quiet, humble figure could actually roar like a lion. It's a very, very, very powerful image. And one of the things, that we see here, and this is on the front page of your notes for the handouts on screen for you now, is this is a stained glass window that actually comes from a place called the Red Castle, Castell Coch in Cardiff, Wales, right? And pictured there obviously is St. David. And like most of these things, again, there's deep allegorical and symbolic imagery that's tied into this. For him, he's almost usually portrayed with two things. One, a dove, and you can see that there on his right shoulder, okay? So his right shoulder, a dove. And if you look, it's not as obvious, but if you look on where he's standing on the ground, but if you notice it's slanted upward, okay? This is coming from a later legend, right? In the decades and centuries that would follow, of when he gave that speech, a miracle occurred. The ground rose up beneath him so that all could hear him speak and project his voice over, and a bird flew by, a dove in this case, and rested on his shoulders. Right? Part of this is hagiography, so part of this is using allegory and typology to make a point. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's entirely possible that this did happen. We don't have to blindly assume it did, but we also don't have to deny it, right? Believe it or not, I was not there. But it's not outside the possibility. It absolutely could have happened. I don't dismiss miraculous accounts throughout history just because, right? In fact, ironically, just as a very brief aside, blindly just dismissing any miraculous account, for starters, is probably a bit arrogant, because it assumes that, oh no, they're just silly, superstitious people, right? Which is just not true, in all cases at least. Secondly, and more importantly, it's borderline assuming an atheistic view of the world, almost like I mentioned in the sermon, because the instinct to not believe it is assuming that miraculous things can't or don't happen, or that no, they can happen, right? And so it is definitely possible that this did happen. I don't know if it did or didn't. I have no problem believing it. Doesn't change anything. I have no problem believing that it did. It doesn't necessarily mean it did, but I have no problem with believing that it did. Either way, though, even at the minimum, understood allegorically, it's still deeply symbolic, because you can see, if it is allegorical, you can see what's going on. The ground rising up beneath him is is elevating the voice, right? So the voice is being proclaimed over all the earth. The white dove should be even more obvious. It's representing the Holy Spirit. So basically, if it is a hagiography, meaning it's where you write a story about a very prominent Christian, right, a saint, right? Hagios, meaning saint. Okay, so hagiography. The one that I've been referring to many times here from that later figure, Rugovark, he writes a work called The Life of David. Okay, that's where he's drawing from other earlier historical archives and documents that he has access to. Okay, but even if this is just purely hagiographical and not historical, in the sense of it literally happening, it's indicating how his speech was viewed there at Brevi and how his life. He was raised up from lowly estate. We've been talking about that a fair bit, to a higher estate, right? He was raised up by God and inspired by God, not in the kind of capital I biblical sense, but lowercase I, inspired by God to defend the faith and to preach the truth and to care for the poor and to help all people through the monastery, all these kinds of things he would do, right? That's the kind of imagery that is ultimately given of him, right? And so I'll leave you with, very fittingly, I'll leave you with actually the words, the closing of his last sermon, his final sermon. It's the one thing it's one of the direct things that we have of his words that were then maintained through the same monastery, St. David's, right? So the latest source that's coming from the life of David is drawing from archives of his last sermon that they had access to at the time. Unfortunately, they would lose it eventually because that monastery would be destroyed and other such things as well, okay? But alas, they had that at the time in which it was written. So we fortunately had that preserved in these works, right? I'll save you the trouble and I'll read you the English version, right? If you want me to read the Welsh, I can do it after. But lords, brothers and sisters, be joyful and keep your faith and your creed and do the little things that you have seen me do and heard about. And as for me, I will walk the path that our fathers have trod before us. Very beautiful words. Right, so he's addressing the faithful, the lords, the brothers and sisters, right? Calls them to be joyful, right? To rejoice in God, keeping in mind that they're in the middle of a time of great chaos and calamity and change, right? Keep the faith and the creed. So keep the faith, the Christian faith, and the creed, the Nicene Creed, right? So he's referring to the Nicene Creed, okay? The creed, the profession of the faith, right? And then a phrase which has become, which even in Wales to this day is still actually a phrase which is just part of Welsh culture, which is that middle portion there. Do the little things, right? Many Welshmen, especially if they actually know Welsh, will know of that phrase. It's actually a common, like we have phrases in Australia that are just kind of Australian colloquialisms, right? In Wales, the colloquialism of technically the full phrase is do the little things in life, okay? Do the little things is a phrase which even Welsh people know to this day, most of them. And it's drawing from this very source, right? Because St. David invents it, again, his prominence to the Welsh nation and the life of those people is so central that, for starters, he is eventually proclaimed patron saint of Wales, just like Patrick is to Ireland, right? The 1st of March, which is the day that he dies, right? So we know the day that he dies, and you can see that I listed as circa 589 or 601. There is some debate among scholars. 589 is the more traditional date. 601 works with other information because we don't have the literal year of his date, but we do know that he died on Tuesday, the 1st of March. That just sometimes happens that way, right? There's other things in history that happen that way, even just kind of other pagan things, where we get the really specific date, but we don't know the exact year sometimes. And so this final sermon he had literally preached. He was elderly, his health was fat. He was older there at that time period now because he's born around 500. Either way, he lives to almost at least 90, if not older, if not actually lives a century. And so that's his final sermon, and then passes away on the 1st of March. In fact, the single thing that is known about David to have absolutely happened is that he died on the 1st of March. So the 1st of March is the basically like national day of Wales to this day, right? St. David's Day, okay? It is to them what Australia Day is to us, just for different reasons. But the beautiful message, and then finishes with this incredible line, right? Something that's very deep and profound. As for me, and it has a kind of double meaning to it as well. I'll try and explain what it is. And as for me, I will walk the path that our fathers have trod before us, right? He's talking doubly here. In this case, he's talking about the fact that he will walk the path, in other words, heaven. He will receive salvation and head into the glories of the afterlife, right? He will tread the path that I will tread the path that our fathers have trod before us, because he's old. But in doing so, he's actually calling all of his people to, in this life, tread the path that our fathers have walked before us, to live a faithful Christian life. See what I mean? Walk the path that our fathers have trod before us. It's the same exact ethos and motif and message, ultimately, that even what we're going through in Deuteronomy is calling Christians to do, right? How many times does the book of Deuteronomy refer back to walking the path of our father Abraham? Do you know what I mean? That's the exact same mentality. It's just like how the Apostle Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Not because he's being arrogant, but because if you were on this earth in the temporal sense, you're sitting there in Corinth. If you follow the earthly example of Paul, well, Paul is following the example of Christ and doing quite a bang-on job of it, to be honest with you. So you're going to get, by following him, you are going to be following Christ, right? That's just called leadership. That's the whole point of leadership. The leader should be emulating a higher, transcendent ideal. In this case, for us as Christians, it's not just an ideal in the sense of the Greek sense of an idea, literally an idea, right? An idea, but rather a person, Jesus Christ. So true leadership, as he demonstrated so beautifully throughout his life, as the Abbot of Menevia, as effectively Archbishop of Wales, as all these various things, leading people in this calamitous, chaotic time, he walked the faithful paths that his forefathers had trod before him, and is calling his people, after his own departure from this world, to continue on that path. It's why you hear me so often talk about the fact that, it's why I talk so often about us returning to the path of our ancestors. Notice you never hear me say, if we just copied like the year 1250 or something, then we'd be sorted. We can't do that. We don't have a DeLorean, we don't have a time machine, there's no going back to. What there is, though, is there's getting back on the path that our ancestors had trod before us, that's heading in the direction into the future, right? It's the same path. It is the way, the truth, and the life. For that reason, it is why Christians, often in the early days of the church in the first century, referred to, among other names, this religion as the way, right? It is the path. And so he's saying he will, in this double sense, he will tread the path that his father trod. He is going to die, and he is going to be raised into heaven, right, by the grace of God. And then eventually on the day of judgment be raised back from the dead in all glory and righteousness. So he's about to tread that path. And he's then, by doing that, calling them, because of course the whole example is he's giving instructions, right? Be joyful, keep your faith in your creed, right? So be faithful. How important is that for him? Because he spoke at the Council of Brevi against heresy. So he's calling on his people, don't fall into the errors of Pelagius, in other words, right? And do the little things that you have seen me do and heard about. That's literally Paul saying, basically, follow me as I follow Christ, right? The little things, right? The things that might seem insignificant to you. The things that though the world around us, and how pertinent is this to our time, good grief, though there's all of this world-altering change and flux and calamity and all these kinds of things going on, there's wars and there's economic collapses and changes of this and politics that and whatever else. You can't change all those things. Those are things and powers beyond your own personal control. Do the little things. Focus on the things that you can actually physically see, physically touch, that you can work on with your own hands, because they're not insignificant. That humble monastery in St. David's preserves Christianity in the island of Great Britain along with the others, to such a degree that if they had not been there, it's entirely possible that Christianity would have died out in Britain. And we would, A, for starters, not be here, right? We would still be back in Europe, right? Because anything over here comes about as a result of Christian culture. And B, we would still be running around the woods worshipping trees and demons. So what seemed like a small little humble thing, which is exactly what it was, didn't just seem like it, it was a small little humble thing as a general rule, ends up becoming this great thing. And how beautifully, by the way, is that, I suppose, symbolised or typified in the fact that this small, humble monastery there on the far western peninsula of the island of Great Britain ends up eventually having this gigantic, beautiful Gothic cathedral built there. So like the tiny little mustard seed, quote unquote, grows into a centre of Christianity, which is to this day the single most significant religious site in all of Wales. In the medieval period, again, theology aside, in the medieval period, it was so significant that even the Pope at one point, probably about 1,000 years after this point, during the 500 years after this point, during the Norman days, the Pope himself declared that two religious pilgrimages to St. David's was equivalent to a pilgrimage to Rome. Right? That doesn't mean anything to us, but to medievals it meant everything. That's an incredible legacy from a very humble estate of things by a man who was in all accounts very humble, but worked very hard, and who was also able to bear great courage and bring to bear truth and light and confidence in God, despite the things in his own background and his own life. Right? So, that's, that's, if you ever see that flag, it's a gold, better image on your page, obviously the gold, this is the flag of St. David, it's the gold flag on the black background. And it's a beautiful image, by the way. The only reason I bothered including it is the fact that it's an image of, it's very deeply symbolic of his own life. The black background, the dark, black, a symbol of humility and piety in heraldry, a symbol of the dark circumstance of his own birth and the humble estate of his life, but a golden cross shining through it, just like the truth and the light of Christ shone through him at the Council of Brevy, shone through him in all the people that he helped and worked, in many cases literally saved, right? And so the light of Christ shining on a very dark backdrop ends up becoming the symbol that gets heraldically attributed to St. David. So that's it. There we go. Even in figures which you may never have heard of, there is great multitude of inspiration and encouragement and such things to learn, because God works ultimately through his people. He works through his people. He works through people like you and me. And even those of various different circumstances can, by God's grace, rise above and through those things and have impacts that greatly outgrow and outweigh whatever they see accomplished in their own life. It'd be fascinating for David to come back and see the incredible impact and effect that he had on the culture and the history and the life of, all of Britain really, but particularly and especially the Welsh people. Yeah.